You're listening to the fifth episode of the podcast series Human Conditions. I'm your host, Adam Shatz, and with me today is a new guest who will be with us for the next four episodes, the writer and critic and reporter, Pankaj Mishra, the author of the recent novel Run and Hide, of The Age of Anger, and of many other books. The subject of this episode's conversation is V.S. Naipaul's novel, A House for Mr. Biswas, published in 1961 and widely recognized as Naipaul's first masterpiece. Thanks for joining us, Pankaj.
Thank you, Adam.
Now, in an essay in the New York Review of Books published more than 20 years ago, you wrote that it's the small, unnoticed tragedies of a displaced, impoverished people, unprotected in a small agricultural colony, and holding on to their self-enclosed but fragile Hindu world that makes A House for Mr. Biswas more than just one of the finest 20th century novels in English. It's also a valuable historical record of what would have been an intellectually neglected part of the world. Neglected because sometimes certain worlds don't seem important enough politically or culturally to be recorded, and more often than not, because they don't produce writers and intellectuals who can note their rise or passing. Now, Pankaj, when I read this passage, I thought of a book published just 2 years later by a great British historian, British Marxist historian, E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class. Thompson spoke explicitly of his desire to rescue his subjects, his working class subjects, from the enormous condescension of posterity. Do you think that's what Naipaul was essentially doing in this novel?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think before that, he had published a couple of books before House for Mr. Biswas, and they were also concerned with rescuing from historical obscurity a kind of person in a small peasant colony in the middle of nowhere at the edge of the world. And, he's obviously extremely aware of himself being one of those people who don't have a place in the world, don't have a place in the world prescribed for them by their class, by their national origin, by their racial origin. And so he's intensely aware of this right from the beginning of his writing career. And House to Mr. Biswas comes, as I said, after these other narratives, these short stories, a novel, and again, same characters set in Trinidad, describing a predominantly rural world. There are urban aspects to these early fictions of his, and House for Mr. Biswas is to a large extent set in the city of Port of Spain in Trinidad. But a large part of the novel, in fact, I would say the first 100 to 125 pages, are devoted to describing in tremendous detail this vanished, in fact, that world had started to vanish even when Naipaul was a child in Trinidad in the 1930s, this sort of extremely rural world. Again, rural worlds don't produce writers, especially rural worlds in remote colonies of the Caribbean. So I think for a writer like Naipaul, there's something more to the vocation of writing. It's almost as a kind of historical responsibility that a writer from a part of the Caribbean has to fulfill, which is to describe people who would otherwise be lost to us and certainly lost to literature.
So he's writing from the imperial hinterlands, as it were, with this unusual sense of historicity or of historical responsibility, and he's writing about the world that brought him into being. And it's not India, it's Trinidad, or it's India by way of Trinidad. I'm wondering, whether you might talk a bit about, before we get to the plot of this story, how Naipaul ends up in Trinidad. I believe that his grandfather came to Trinidad in 1880, and that Naipaul's own father, C. Prasad, who is the inspiration for the protagonist of this novel, Mr. Biswas, Mohan Biswas, was born in 1906 in Trinidad.
Yes, so I mean, the Indian presence in the Caribbean is, of course, part of this extraordinary movements of labor, indentured labor in this case, from British ruled India to various parts of the world. And Naipaul's family is very much a part of this extremely destitute community of upper caste North Indian Brahmins who are forced to essentially leave India because there are so few opportunities in their own country, and to go to Trinidad on a sort of contract basis. And of course, once they get there and they start this life of just endless labor and misery, they get even further away from home. So they kind of essentially create a little India in the midst of Trinidad, holding on to their ancestral religion, holding on to their inherited traditions. In fact, obviously, even more determined to hold on to them than they would have been had they stayed behind. And so Naipaul and Naipaul's father, more specifically, is born in this very kind of traditional world and sort of grows up in it. And the 100 pages, the early first 100 pages of Mr. Biswas is describing Naipaul's father's childhood. I should say that Mohan Biswas, the main character of the novel, is basically based on Naipaul's father, who he revered, largely because he inherited his ambition to write from his father. And it is an extraordinary life in many ways, sort of essentially a man who's born in a peasant family and sort of is almost entirely self taught, becomes a journalist at the very end of his life and manages to educate his son, and it's a story that Naipaul seems to be obsessed with, even after writing A House for Mr. Biswas, even after writing this sort of novel-length tribute to his father, because it's also a story that describes the very painful, very slow journey into the modern world of millions and millions of people in the so-called colonial and post-colonial world. So the story has a sort of tremendous resonance because in one sense it's describing the journeys of essentially a vast majority of the world's population in the modern era in all those sort of societies in Asia and Africa, which have made the transition, or some are still making it, from a predominantly rural and agricultural world to the world of big cities, to the world of factories and offices.
Right, because this is the story of of an encounter with Western modernity in a colonial context, and it's also a story of what Naipaul himself called the great fact of the 20th century, the movement of peoples. And you mentioned that Naipaul's family and other Indians originally from Uttar Pradesh and North India who came to Trinidad created a kind of little India there. And it's notable, I think, that this is a novel written in English, a novel that owes much to the 19th century British novel, and yet we're constantly being told that a certain conversation is happening in Hindi, not in English. And the spoken language in this novel is, it's not exactly a dialect, but it's a language that is permeated with Indian words and with Caribbean inflections.
Very accented, a kind of patwa, you might call it. And it's interesting to actually hear it spoken because it's a very particular accent, it's a very particular way of speaking English, and actually it doesn't have much in common with the English spoken in North India by, let's say, people belonging to the same caste and class. But what's really interesting about this book, you mentioned the year of its publication, 1961, and you said that it's very much a novel in a kind of 19th century British tradition. So a novel published in 61, a very old-fashioned narrative in one sense, 30, 40 years after the British novel has already embraced modernism. But in a way, it's reminding us, and I suppose the date of the publication is important, that for a large majority, actually, one could say that with confidence, a large majority of the world's population is still in a different historical trajectory altogether. That this is something very different from the historical experience of Western Europe and the United States. I mean, when you think about, let's say, a character based novel that comes around the same time, we're talking here of, let's say, Herzog.
Or a Kingsley Amis novel, for that matter.
Exactly, for that matter. How different in so many aspects is this character from Trinidad from his English and American counterparts?
Thanks for listening to this extract from Human Conditions, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. To listen to the full episode and all our other close reading series, sign up to our close reading subscription at lrb.me/close readings or click on the link in the description.